Can I ask you a personal question? I mean, it's really personal. I have no right to ask you. And you don't have to answer me. Do you ever cuss? You ever take God's name in vain? You know, slang language, so forth. Well, number one, I think God takes into consideration that most of us who grew up around rough-speaking people or spent a lot of time in the locker room at gym or football practice may have picked up some things that we really didn't know what we were saying. And when we found out, it sort of formed a habit. And the habit was a habit. It wasn't something we did intentionally. We weren't trying to ask God to condemn anybody, but that kind of language slipped out. And you know, it's a real problem if you stop and think about it, because when you read the Bible, especially the Ten Commandments, especially the third commandment, you'll find that God does not take lightly our using His name carelessly, casually, or in vain. I'll be right back and we'll talk about it. This is Dan Griffin again with the Weekly Word, and I'm standing in a very important place in our church. It's an important place in any church, because right where I am, in front of the pulpit, down at the front of the church, front of the front row, this is where people get married. They take the deepest, most meaningful vows of their entire life when they stand here before God and the minister and the families in the church and say, "I do." But this is also an important place because it's right here, most of the time, when people who come forward in a church, especially an evangelistic church, and make a profession of faith in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, they do it right here. So this is really, in my mind, holy ground. And holy ground reminds me of that ancient shepherd named Moses, who was wandering around on the back 40 of the Kadesh Barnea Peninsula. And he saw a bush over in the distance, maybe a quarter of a mile away, maybe a half a mile. And he noticed it in the morning, and it was burning, and he thought, well, some kind of spontaneous combustion had started that fire. And then he noticed at noon it was still burning, and he thought, well, it'll probably burn itself out this afternoon. But in the middle of the afternoon, it hadn't. And so he couldn't stand it any longer. And he herded the sheep up and made them walk over there to the bush. He couldn't leave them alone. And there he's standing with his face feeling the heat of the fire. And it's a fire like he's not seen before. It's red, it's yellow, it's orange, and yet it's hot. And it throws out light, and then all of a sudden it threw out something else. A voice. "Moses! Moses!" And Moses responded, and God said, "Take off your sandals, don't come any closer. You are standing on holy ground." And you know that story. Perhaps you've read it or heard it preached. It's a wonderful story. Jesus liked this story. He quoted it in the New Testament in the 22nd chapter of Matthew. Moses finally, when he could not argue God out of sending him back to Egypt where he was wanted for murder, he said, "Well, if I do go, they're going to ask me who sent me. What is your name?" And God responded, "I am the God of your father." Do you know who Moses' father was? Amram. His mother's name was Jochebed. And he says, "I am also the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Tell them that I am hath sent you." Now, when we look at those Hebrew words, what we come up with is, it means, it's the word we call Yahweh. It's the oldest word we have for God. And it means, in essence, I am the one who has in his own being the reason for his being. He's the creator. He's the one who called anything and everything out of nothingness into somethingness. And this is the God who revealed himself to one man out in the middle of the wilderness. He really comes to all of us that way, doesn't he? Somehow we learn his name and we learn his nature, and we come to trust his character. I want you to hear it in the original Greek words. Now, I can't read Greek, so I'll just trust the translation of the New International Version of the Bible. The third commandment says, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Now, that was in about 1200, maybe 1300 BC, 1250, something like that. By the time 1200 BC rolled around, Moses had led the children back out of the wilderness of Egypt into the wilderness of Kadesh Barnea. And he went up on Mount Sinai, and God had him take 2 tablets, and God wrote on those tablets. And the third thing he wrote was, don't take my name in vain. Well, by the time you get to the 750s BC, we have a prophet by the name of Jeremiah. Let me tell you what Jeremiah said. This is in the 7th chapter. Listen to these words. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name, and say to yourselves, we're safe, we're inside God's house. Has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? And then this sobering sentence, but I have been watching, declares the Lord. Whew, that's powerful stuff. And most of the locker room boys and chatter don't stop to think about that when they rattle off all these profanities and obscenities, hoping to impress each other, I think. Or the people who write the movie sitcoms and put God's name in every other sentence. And so we even have it in our text messaging, O-M-G. And maybe with an exclamation point. Now, I don't think the people who do this with any sense of slapping God in the face or misusing his name. They just don't stop and think. And that's really the greatest sin of all, is not stopping to think. You see, in this world, are you listening? In this world, there are things that are sacred and there are things that are profane. And profane things, that's where we get profanity. It's the opposite of sacred. There are some things that are very holy, and we should treat them holy, like God's name, his house, his day, his commandments. But there's nothing holy left in America, is there? Is there anything that the comedians cannot take to make fodder for their routines? Does anybody hallow anything else? Is anything hallowed? What is it that the Lord's Prayer says? You remember the Lord's Prayer that you can rattle off yourself from memory? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And God is very jealous about his name as well as he is about his children. He won't tolerate us worshiping some other God. It brings out the mother in him. And he pretends us, and he protects us, and he goes after us, and he grabs us and brings us back if we belong to him. So I just want to say a couple of things more, and then I'll quit. Names are funny sometimes, you know. Marilyn and I still laugh about a doctor we heard about in Oklahoma whose name was Dr. Safety R. First. Then there was that incredible example of a couple who had a child. Their last name was Nicholas. So what did they name their little baby? Not St. Nicholas. No, they didn't do that well. They named him Nicholas, Nicholas, Nicholas. Unbelievable lack of imagination. So names are funny, but names can also be revealing. You see, I told you in a prior video that God chose to reveal himself through words and through his name. So if God gives us his name, he's giving us power. He's giving us access to him. I don't like big crowds. I hardly ever go to the State Fair of Texas because I don't like to mix and mingle with crowds. They sometimes make me a little nervous, and I don't move as fast as I used to, so I guess I'm a little afraid of getting trampled or something. But if I'm in a crowd and I get separated from Marilyn by even 50 yards, all I have to do is say, "Marilyn." And if she's within earshot, and I promise you her ears are better than a dog's, she'll hear me and she'll turn her head. It's like I had a string on the back of her head. And that's the way it is with God, who not only hears well, but he's watching. And when we call his name, we get his attention. You've all heard the story of the boy that cried wolf. What if you called out to God's name over and over and over in profanity, and every time you said his name, God's head turned towards you, and yet you didn't ask him for anything? You weren't calling out properly. Well, is there a proper way? Oh yeah. The proper way is to call out like that man in the Bible who said, "Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner, and save me." Luke wrote in Acts, "There is no other name given among men whereby we must be saved." This is the name that can change sin into forgiveness. It can change hell-bound into heaven-bound. Have you made that decision? I hope you will. Next week, a new commandment. Thank you for tuning in today. You might want to see the information on the bottom of the screen and get in touch with us through our website. Whatever we can do to help you, we want to do. Because, as I've told you before, God really loves you just like you are, and so do I.